Of school, and we love this place, and we love being Lakers. I also have two sisters, one who is here, and she is a high school art teacher in Chaska, and my youngest sister is a farmer. She runs an organic livestock farm up north, so we are definitely impacted by politics in our family, and have always been really into it. So I'm super excited to be here with Ms. Craig. We're really excited for today's event, and as we begin, we are going to hear the national anthem sung by our 8th grade choir here. So come on up, and you can stand and remove your hats.
Okay. This is great.
You were great.
Thank you so
Just
much
wonderful.
to the Hicko's Middle School Choir. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, your heart.
Thank you, Bacon.
I can't even do my job without crying. There are babies. Okay, so before we get things rolling, if I can read, I'd like to lay out the ground rules for the event in order to keep this town hall respectful and make sure that we have time to take as many questions as possible. We will be keeping the following ground rules. So first of all, this town hall has Minnesota rules, which means we will all treat one another with respect. Questions are great and welcomed. Obscenity is not allowed, and will keep each person from enjoying the town hall. Each person will have 1 minute to ask one question. Everyone gets to ask one question before anyone gets to ask a second question. And if they would like to ask another question, they're free to get back in line at the end of the event. But if they have not asked a question by the time 1 minute rolls around, I'll be prompting you to ask your question at that time. Angie's responses to each question will be limited to 2 minutes so that we can get to as many questions as possible. If she goes over her 2 minutes, she will be prompted to end her comments by moi. I'm nervous about that part.
You're going to have support, Megan, because I also get D.
Okay. Yeah.
This is how we do it.
Okay, good. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Representative Craig to make your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. It's truly an honor to be back in Prior Lake and to be conducting my 9th town hall since I became a member of Congress. I always like to start each of these events by asking the veterans in the room to raise your hand. Thank you for your service to our communities. If you would, please stand. I would like to say and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start with some opening remarks, and then we will go straight into Q&A. Many of you have been to the last couple of town halls where we wanted to get a little more detail into some policy discussions around things like education and healthcare. We're back to our original format here today, where I'm going to offer an update to the community and the Congressional District on the work that I've been doing as a member of Congress, and then we'll just open it up for your questions over the course of the remainder of the hour. I always start by introducing my district staff. I want to make sure that you know who they are. That way, if you have an individual issue, you can come see them after. Nick Coe is my district director. Nick, wave. There you go. And I don't see Morris here today, but Morris Allen is one of my constituent advocates who works with a lot of our local communities, particularly in the southern part of the district. And I also want to recognize Nate Fowler, who is a second constituent services advocate. We also have a number of people here who do casework. Christina in the back of the room. Put your hand up, thank you. And Kaylee in the front of the room, who has the bell. And so I just want to make sure and pause here and say, these two women, along with Mike Siebenaller in the room here today, they are responsible for helping you with any issues you have navigating the federal government. And we've had some great success in helping our veterans work their way through the bureaucracy of the VA to get access to needed medical treatment. We've had great successes in helping seniors get access to the Social Security or disability benefits that they are eligible for, and in addition to a number of other success stories. So I want to acknowledge this team and say, if you have a neighbor or a friend or a family member with any sort of issue, that is why your district staff is here and our district office is based in Burnsville. I want to also just recognize, even though they're not here, my legislative team in DC, because I'm about to talk about some of the bills that I've introduced or that I've co-sponsored or that I'm advocating for. There is a strong connection here in the district from the work that people like Nate are doing back to the DC office, who have the responsibility to then draft and put those bills into the hopper and try to get them passed into law, so thank you. During the district work period, and that's what I call it, I don't know, the term recess offends me a little bit because we had 74 official visits in this congressional district during that August work period when members of Congress were here in the district instead of in DC. And so we listened, we did a lot of things while we were here, and now that I'm back, I feel compelled just to mention again the fact that 2/3 of the bills that I am co-sponsoring as a member of Congress are actually bipartisan bills. They are bills with both Republicans and Democrats on them. And so I'm working hard to figure out, how do we work across the aisle? How do we find that common ground in this country again? And part of that comes from turning off cable news most days. I get on the plane when I go to DC during the week with the 17 local newspapers from this congressional district in my hand. That way, when I get off in DC of that plane, the last thing that I've read or that I'm thinking about are the priorities of our communities in this congressional district. And this is a diverse district. You know, we've got working folks up in the old meatpacking sector of South St. Paul and West St. Paul who get up still at 5:30 in the morning and pack a lunch and go to work. We've got suburban folks who get up and put a suit on and go into the Twin Cities to work. And we've got folks who live out in the exurban areas of this beautiful congressional district, the Minnesota River, the Mississippi River, and then we've got family farmers in this district. And I want to make the point, because I know Trey has been in the news a lot lately, that 95% of the farmers in the 2nd Congressional District are small farmers. These are not the big corporate farms that we often hear about. And so when I tell you what I worked on this week, I hope that frames the conversation just a little bit. So I was really proud of some of the work that we did in Washington, especially this past week. We introduced, and I haven't had a chance to go through the entire bill, but a package of prescription drug reforms that finally lifts the ban on Medicare negotiating for prescription drug prices in this country. The number one issue that my constituents talk to me about is the price of health insurance, especially in the individual marketplace, which is going to require some reform of the ACA, and the price of prescription drugs. And so in this newly unveiled plan, 250 of the costliest drugs included in Medicare, including insulin, we are going to, when this bill passes, require Medicare to negotiate. And if drug companies aren't willing to come to the negotiating table with Medicare, we're going to have a stiff penalty for those drug manufacturers. Drug costs in this country are 2, 3, 4, 5 times what the international average for those very same drugs are. And it's time that we step up and we take on the drug industry. Now, what I'm most excited about is the package that was introduced also incorporated ideas from the administration. And you saw after this package was introduced, the president tweeted some very kind remarks about the package that was introduced. It also included feedback from Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. So, since we've been sworn in on that topic, we have sent 10 bills over to the Senate, to Mitch McConnell's Senate, to lower the cost of health care and the price of prescription drugs in this country. We have sent bills to protect pre-existing conditions over to the Senate. Not a single one of those bills has been taken up or voted on by this Senate. And as far as I'm concerned, if the Senate wants to vote them down, that's fine. But let's get the Senate on the record about who they represent. Are they representing the constituents that they were elected to represent, or are they representing drug companies in this country? Let's get them on the record. And then finally, on health care, I just want to remind everyone that I'm carrying 2 very important bills that matter to the state of Minnesota on health care. My bill, H.R. 1425, the State Premium Reduction Act, which would lower the cost of individual health insurance in the individual market, has already passed out of Energy and Commerce. Ways and Means next needs to pass my bill, and I've been advocating for that over the course of the last week. I also developed and introduced the Emergency Access to Insulin Act in the U.S. House of Representatives. So it is obviously a very important topic to families across this congressional district, and I just want to thank all the young people who have come to see me to talk about access to insulin over the last little bit. And of course, my colleague Tina Smith is leading that Emergency Access to Insulin Act in the U.S. Senate. Beyond that, I want to mention 3 or 4 other things. One, this week, it passed out of committee, the Resilience Revolving Fund Act. This is essentially an evolving fund for local communities to take out low-cost loans to mitigate against future disasters like flooding and wildfires and hurricanes. It costs $1 to mitigate and $6 to clean up a natural disaster in our communities. And so I was very pleased that this piece of legislation, which was co-sponsored and led by Congressman Rodney Davis of Illinois, a Republican, as well as Rick Crawford from Arkansas, worked very closely with me to get this done. And I'm very pleased it's out of committee. My understanding is that Amy Klobuchar and Marco Rubio are partnering together in the Senate to help get this done. And communities like Prior Lake, like Hastings, like Jordan, where water quality, where the Mississippi River, natural disasters are an issue, this is going to be a very successful piece of legislation, and I'm optimistic that we're going to get this one done. The other thing that has been happening in the background this week is around the topic of biofuels. There is no doubt that when the president took on China, that it was warranted. China has been an offender of intellectual property theft, but I have been highly critical of the way we've gone about the trade war. I'm glad to see that we are now going to go negotiate a deal with Japan for additional trade, but perhaps, as I've been saying for months now, we could have done that before we started the trade war with China. And so I think at this point, our corn producers, our farmers in the 2nd Congressional District, they're stressed and they are hurting. And so biofuels, ethanol in particular, and corn growers is a way that we can both do the right thing for the environment because it reduces carbon emissions. It certainly doesn't eliminate them. And at the same time, we can continue to support our family farmers. At the end of the day, the small refinery oil waivers that the administration has continued to hand out, in my opinion, is putting oil executives over working families and family farmers in this country. And so, as you all know, if you've been to a town hall, my style is if the president, the administration is doing something that I think is right for this district in this country, I say that. And if the administration is doing something that I believe is going to hurt this district, I stand up to that, and that's how I will continue to behave. This week, something else important happened in Congress, and it didn't get a whole lot of attention, but a number of us formed something called the Congressional Caucus to End Youth Vaping. We have a public health emergency in this nation right now. Kids in middle school are being offered cotton candy flavored nicotine. And we cannot stand idly by, and as a member of Congress, I won't, while we allow the next generation of young people to get hooked on nicotine. And I know that the administrators in this room, the teachers in this room, you know the dangers that vaping is causing in our communities. And so this is something that I think we have to be thoughtful about, and I joined the caucus to be part of that conversation. So I'm going to keep working with the administration on the replacement to NAFTA, USMCA. There are a couple of issues that remain, and the administration is having, I understand, productive negotiations with House leadership. Those things are around enforcement of labor provisions in Mexico and around the topic of, again, pharmaceutical pricing of drugs. And so with those two things are resolved, then I think you're going to see me be optimistic about the passage. And if those two things aren't resolved, then I will be less optimistic about its passage. So it sounds like that might be headed in the right direction. And then finally, I just want to say two more things. I continue to push leadership in the U.S. House to bring through committee, as well as to the House floor, the IDEA Full Funding Act. Megan just talked about her own son. I often talk about one of my 4 sons has special needs. And it shouldn't matter. The federal government needs to live up to its commitment to fully fund special education in this country. Right now, ISD 196 and 194 are coming back to taxpayers for more operating levy dollars. And the reason it's happening is because this federal government has not lived up to its commitment. The subsidy in Minnesota for special ed averages between 8 and 15%, nowhere near the 40% that the federal government committed to. So I'm proud to be fighting for this, not only with my Democratic colleagues, but also and especially my Republican colleague Pete Stauber of the 8th Congressional District. He and I have had many conversations, contests to see who could add the most co-sponsors to the bill, and we are encouraging both of our leaderships in the background to bring this forward on behalf of all communities and all Americans, not just the parents of special needs children. Lastly, I just want to say the Humble Act. The Humble Act is something that I introduced to take on corruption in Washington. And I can't let a single town hall go without saying we have already passed H.R. 1. It is the most sweeping election reform in the history of the Congress. It also will take care of the fact that super PACs are spending unlimited amounts of money in our campaigns, that Citizens United needs to go. Corporations are not people, and we shouldn't treat them as such. And if we're going to treat them as such, we need to make sure that every voter knows exactly who is trying to influence your campaigns so that we can all understand what their motivation is. So my bill, the Humble Act, would also, for life, ban any member of Congress from ever serving as a lobbyist in this nation.
Yes.
It would also ban members of Congress from ever holding stocks in companies while serving as a member of Congress.
Nice.
Look, we have a lot of work ahead of us on behalf of the American people. And as long as the special interests in Washington are leading the show, it is a headwind to all of us who are trying to make these reforms. And so I want to say again, thank you for being here. This is what democracy is all about. It's about agreeing, it's about disagreeing. On policy, it's about sometimes agreeing to disagree. And at the end of the day, live in a community and understand that actually our values are not that far apart. It's how we get to those that sets us apart. And that this kind of community conversation is exactly what we need. So thank you again for being here, Megan. Thank you for
All right, thank you. I think it's time to have some questions from the audience. If you want to come forward or get in line, we'll start taking questions.
Hi, Angie. Hi, Megan. I'm Connie Sierras. I'm from Inver Grove Heights. And on the issue of trade with China, you mentioned that, and pharmaceuticals. My understanding is China is the predominant maker of manufacturing of drugs for the United States. And I'm wondering how this Trade Act affects that. It seems like we should maybe be expanding where we get our drugs from if we have only one source. It seems like that's not a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, Connie. And I don't disagree that we need to expand our sources for where our drugs are manufactured. The problem actually starts, though, from a price perspective, that drug manufacturers, wherever they're based in the world, when they receive a U.S. patent to sell their product here, it only takes the change of a color of a pill to extend the life of that patent. Literally, you change your pill from red to blue, and it creates a patent extension. Those same manufacturers, no matter where they base, can pay generic drug companies from entering the U.S. market. And of course, any manufacturer anywhere around the world has to meet the high levels of standards from the Food and Drug Administration to be able to manufacture products that are then sold in the United States. When we talk about China, and we talk about their trade practices over the years, part of that issue has been intellectual property theft. And so what China has historically done is they have required U.S. manufacturers to manufacture in China And typically, it's a 51-49% interest in a joint manufacturing plant or something like that. See, intellectual property was the biggest issue. But instead of addressing intellectual property issues in China, all of a sudden, we have targeted American farmers in China instead. And so I've said from the beginning that I believed we should address the intellectual property challenges. We should have started with the WTO and made sure that China was being held accountable for those practices. Once you start a trade war, no one wins. No one wins. And what we're seeing right now, and I didn't mention in my opening remarks, and apparently I'm not mentioning it now. I'll come back.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Mike Bryan, and I'm from Burnsville. My question today is on transportation and climate change. We have some of the lowest public transit and high-speed rails in the developed world per capita. Other countries view public transit as an investment in their society. Our transportation congestion costs 4 times more than what we're investing annually a year. On top of that, we haven't adjusted the gas and diesel tax since 1993. Yesterday, the world held one of the largest demonstrations we've ever seen with the climate strikes. It started with a young girl in Sweden and grew to millions more a year later. Young people everywhere are scared what the world will be like when they're our age due to the climate change. My question to you is, what changes in transportation system can we hope to see in the future to combat climate change and congestion?
What a great question. Thank you, Michael, for being here. And I want to acknowledge the millions of young people who came out yesterday for the climate strike. It was just extraordinary. And I was in New York this week when Greta just beautifully represented all 16-year-olds all over the world. My 16-year-olds were not like that. They were thinking about other things at that moment in time. But this is one of the reasons I asked to be on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, is because I see that, as well as the Ag Committee, to be honest with you, because I see the opportunity to create good policy and build out our infrastructure for things like electric vehicles in this nation. You know, it's a strange day when the Chamber of Commerce comes to see me proposing 5 cents of a federal gas tax increase over 5 years. And I'm open, and my Republican colleagues are not supporting the current proposal by the Chamber of Commerce. So we all know that unless we invest in this nation's infrastructure, and probably already that this nation has fallen behind. I actually look at this, my work on T&I and Ag, as an opportunity to affect this. Long term, do we need a gas tax, or do we need to move the nation to vehicle miles traveled once we figure out how to do this? And Chairman DeFazio of T&I has made addressing climate a top priority of the T&I committee. I have made working on the Ag Committee and conservation a key part of what I'm working on. Things like incentivizing cover crop plantation so that we can sequester carbon in a very smart way. So I think you're going to see this a high priority, and I implore, and I've said this to Democrats, if the president wants an infrastructure bill, we should give it to him. I stopped. Apparently that's how it's going to go this morning.
Hi, I'm Bill Kramer, live in Savage, and thank you, Angie, for being here and sharing with us and just having this conversation. Certainly, I appreciate all of your efforts in, helping the farmers and education and health. One thing that you said that just kind of struck me, and I would just encourage our representatives to have some conversation about this. You talked about, ethanol, getting that moving again to China and into the market. Well, that is good for the farmers, and I'm all about helping the farmers, and I grew up on a farm, so I know what that's all about. But I also think that there's alternatives to like pushing things like ethanol, because it has a very big lobby. There's a subsidy for ethanol. It fits into climate change that we take on information and facts from scientists that help us get away from using things like ethanol and just using less fuel. To the gentleman's point about public transportation, get people out of their cars. We got to stop using so much fuel in this country. And by supporting ethanol, I mean it's kind of adding fuel to the fire. So,
Can you please ask your question?
thank you. My question is can you put more effort into scientific evidence about how we can do better with climate change?
Absolutely. I don't think there's one solution to addressing climate change in this country. I believe that we have to put a price to the polluters in the form of a carbon fee. The Carbon Innovation Act that Ted Deutsch has introduced, and there are a couple of new ones that I need to take a look at. We need to move this country away from oil. That's what we need to incentivize and prioritize from a policy perspective. And coal. And again, it won't be a magic wand. Certainly, this administration is choosing very directly right now oil companies over ethanol producers. And so if I have to make a choice between those two things, you better bet I'm going to support our corn growers because the carbon emissions from ethanol are less than oil. Is that where we need to be? We need an infrastructure bill that prioritizes electrification and electric cars in this country. We need clean energy policies that recognize that America is doing more than its fair share of the carbon production in the world. And we need to think about, and it's certainly for the perspective of addressing carbon, but it's also just a growth point. It's not that Minnesota isn't growing, we are, but we are likely to lose a congressional seat in after the next census. And that is because places like Austin, Texas, and other places that have been more open to a variety of transit options are attracting young people and innovation and companies and those sorts of things. So I think, we have to be incredibly thoughtful, and I am incredibly committed. There's interesting carbon sequestration policy, development of technology out there that I want to continue to look at, and you bet this is a priority for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
This is the most organized change. This is awesome.
My name is Tanya Schaubert, and I've been a teacher for 22 years, just like Megan, and I teach across the street with Megan. We have 3 kids who are in our school system. And in my 22 years, I'd never say this, but in my 22 years of education, it's changed. But one of the things that's been a big change is testing. And we just found out this week that our students will be even taking more local tests, standardized tests. So they could take anywhere from 7 to 9 sessions at 2 to 3 hours apiece. We're talking upwards of 30 hours of testing for state and local standardized tests, which is, like, from a math perspective in my class, it could be 15% of my instruction time is watching them take standardized tests. So, which is a little bit insane. So my question is, what is your plan to reduce high stakes testing, and particularly in regards to how schools are funded based on those testings?
Well, first of all, thank you for doing what you do every single day. Someone once asked me, not in a very nice way, why I thought I was qualified to be a member of Congress. And I actually said to them, because I've survived middle school 4 times. But the idea that, Megan has 170 middle school kids come through her classroom every single day, we should all just, bow like that. So thank you. Look, this is the reason why I so strongly supported getting rid of No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
Because the situation that this created in today's public schools, where it forced administrations and teachers to teach to a test, instead of to teach to the capacity and the capability and the creativity of every single student in this country, was devastating. And it also contributed to one of my biggest pet peeves, and that is that our post-secondary education system is so highly focused on every student going to a four-year college.
Yeah.
We have got to rethink not only what's happening, because it's all related. Of my 4 sons, my son Josh, he chose to go to trade school because he loves to work with his hands. And we need to make sure that every student understands that that is an option to them. And so, mandatory tests, additional mandatory tests, we've given more tests, but we haven't actually done anything substantial to reduce the gaps that we're seeing in today's educational system. So we can't keep doing the same things over and over again, and that's why with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind, we've been particularly focused on, how do we give you the tools you need to be successful and for every child to be successful. But I don't believe that more standardized tests are going to help us produce more successful children in this nation. In fact, I think it pushes us backward. Thank you.
Good morning, Representative Craig. My name is Jeff Worselevelt. I live outside of New Prague. My topic is involving impeachment process. And my understanding of the Mueller report is that there are multiple indications in there that President Trump committed obstruction of justice. It is also a fact, as I understand it, that he is receiving money from outside countries and agencies, buying into the Trump brand in a number of different ways, which to me violates the Emoluments Clause. It is also my understanding that over half of the Democrats in the House of Representatives have indicated that they are in favor of impeachment proceedings. And my last understanding of where you were at is that you were non-committal, you were waiting. So what I would like to ask of you.
We should let him go.
4 seconds. What I would like to ask of you is where you stand on the impeachment process right now and why. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Jeff, thank you for being here. I will start with, my position has been consistent throughout. The committee investigations that are underway in Judiciary and in the House Intelligence Committee are incredibly important. And so that work, as you are seeing play out, is underway every single day. The committees are doing their work. I've also said that this is one of the most important decisions that any member of Congress will ever make. And I have decided that I would like to see the results of those investigations completed from a due process perspective before I make a final judgment. But I am very supportive of the investigations underway in the U.S. House committees. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Georgia Cannon. I'm from Carter Lake, and I just had a question since you're on the Ag Committee. Big issue for me is Monsanto and the Roundup. It was introduced several chemicals within that Roundup in 75, and since that time we've had, right, between that and the food pyramid, it's been the autism rates, ADHD increases, Alzheimer's, numerous physical, mental problems that we've been seeing that's virtually going to collapse the healthcare system, right? Because we can't take care of all these people, regardless of what kind of healthcare system we have. I mean, we're going to be outnumbered. The trajectory right now, like for autism and different things, is going high, and there's there's gotta be some correlation here, right? And with Roundup, it's in our food and the GMO foods and how they utilize it. And there's no testing. Monsanto's a monster in the room. They do not allow for testing. Their trials are only 3-month trials. You don't see the effects until the 4th month, right? So there's so many things that are going on right now in our societies that I feel are from some of these things, and so what are you gonna do about it?
I would, thank you so much.
Anything.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for being a contributor to an ag economy. The more I've gotten to know family farmers and the challenges that they're facing, it's just been extraordinary. And every farmer I've ever met with wants to be a good steward of the land and the environment, and so how do we allow them to do that and still have access? Look, I support additional FDA and USDA oversight for the chemicals that are going into our food. I think we ought to look at NIH further on how can we study the impacts. And I know there's a bit of controversy related in the research on autism on a number of things. It's just not absolutely clear. But I hear you, and as you asked me the climate change question a moment ago, there's no doubt we're seeing, extreme weather in this country. The base is climate change, and I'm going to follow the science on this issue and on the climate change issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nervous.
Hi, I'm Loretta Welch. I too have been teaching for 22 years. This is my 20th year teaching 8th grade global studies at Hidden Oaks, and I like to think of myself as Megan's non-biological sister. I recently saw a show on CBS Sunday Morning about teachers in Oklahoma and Arizona, and it was sad because it was hit close to home. I could relate. And so as teachers, we have a 4-year degree, we have a master's degree, plus several continuing ed credits that we pay for ourselves. And after 22 years of teaching, many of us still need to work 2 to 3 additional jobs to make ends meet. What are your plans to support teachers so that they are paid to reflect their experience, education, and expertise? Because let's face it, there's not a teacher shortage. There is a lack of people who are not willing to work under the extremely stressful, micromanaged conditions. And we are losing really amazing, talented people because they just can't afford to do this job.
Yes.
Woo! Yes.
Wow. Thank you for what you do. Thank you. Well, look, you named a couple of states. I'll bet you there's right to work laws in those states. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've co-sponsored the PRO Act to protect the right to organize and collectively bargain in this nation. And I'll tell you, this hits home personally. My mother is 66 years old. I've told the story before. I grew up, she was a single mom. She had 3 kids. We lived in a mobile home court. In fact, we lived in many mobile home courts. I watched her go back to school for 9 years to finish that degree to become a teacher. Today in Arkansas, my mom makes just over $40,000 a year after teaching for her entire career because of Arkansas's right to work laws. So that's the first thing, and I wanted to just explain why that is so critical and important. Look, we should honor our teachers like we do our doctors in this nation. Some of the tangible things that I've done, sponsor the PRO Act so that there is a level playing field across this country. The other thing that is abominable to me is the amount of money each of you are spending in your classrooms. And so I've sponsored a bill that would double the amount of tax deduction eligibility when you have to buy things out of pocket. And I've looked at a number of other ways that we could possibly get teachers some sort of either tax benefit, making sure that if you're serving our nation through teaching our children, that perhaps we make it easier for your college loans to be forgiven. There's a number of things that we can do. And then finally, I'm going to say this, because this is important too. I have seen way too many really good new teachers get cut in this state in the last few years because the federal government is not living up to its commitment to fund special education. Because you have to go into the operating and you have to cut somewhere, and it is an absolute tragedy that it's good teachers. Thank you so much.
So I'm Kim Churchill, I live in Prior Lake. And one quick comment, and then I have a question that's completely different. So I disagree with the idea of impeachment. I think it wastes the government's time because we all know that the Senate is not going to ratify it. And it's just going to give a rallying point for people that are in support of President Trump. And I think that our government needs to spend time governing instead of wasting time on, going up a hill that is never going to get over. And it's just a ridiculous waste of time. I appreciate the work that you do, the hard work of actually governing, and I don't think that we need to waste our time and our taxpayers' money on something that we know is never going to come to fruition. My question is completely different. There is a national health crisis in gun violence, and I'm wondering if anything is being done to get rid of the ban on research with the NIH and the CDC about gun violence.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your comments. As you can imagine, with 800,000 constituents in a congressional district, the ranges of opinion on a lot of topics vary dramatically. The short answer is yes. The idea that we have banned the CDC from even researching gun violence in this nation is abominable, because at the end of the day, this is a national public health emergency in our country. I'm at a little bit of loss for words here on the topic of, we have two very good bills that are common sense gun safety reforms on the Senate's desk right now. Universal background checks and closing the Charleston loophole. Two very good bills that when I go to the West End Trap Club where I belong and my family and boys shoot trap, gun owners, hunters agree with me that these are very common sense things that we can do to start to address gun violence in this country. So Kim, you obviously know I voted for both of those bills when they passed the House. I'd like to see the CDC research bill come out as well. There are some additional bills that are coming out of committee right now on limiting the size of magazines, other what most people consider to be common sense gun safety reforms. And at the end of the day, after this last massacre in El Paso, I was with my son Jacob, and he was going back to college the next week. And many parents across this district right now are sitting there with their kids saying, what are you going to do to keep me safe, Mom? What are you doing to keep me safe, Dad? My son, my own son, looks at me and says, Mom, what are you going to do to help keep me safe? So this is personal. I know many parents are coming up to me just on the street, in the grocery store, in my own neighborhood, saying, my kid just came home this week from an active shooter drill. The teachers in this room, you know what this is like. And we can do something about it, and shame on us if we don't.
Hi Angie, my name is Michael Nelson. I'm from Savage. I have a very open-ended question for you, but first I'd like to say that I'm a parent of 3 kids in the Prior Lake Savage District, and we've had the good fortune of having four of the teachers who spoke today teach our children. Way to go.
And they're great.
That's not what my kids' teachers say.
I'm sure they would have. I am coming to you as a parent and also as a very new school board member, and I have a very open-ended, naive question for you. I'm trying to learn. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. But I want to support these teachers and these kids and this district. What, as a parent, and secondarily, as a school board member, would you recommend I can most effectively and urgently and importantly do to impact how we fund our schools and how we prioritize education? How can I best use my time and get the people around me to use their time?
Well, I just thank you for being here, Michael, and also for stepping up and running for office in this country. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, I truly believe the heart of our funding problem in this nation rests on the responsibility of the federal government. We made two commitments as a federal government, that we were going to help close the gap between schools that had generous resources and schools that couldn't afford the property taxes. And we committed to fund special education in this nation. Those were the two commitments that we made. And so what I would ask, because what I'm learning as a member of Congress is, you know, you hear from a few people, and that's great. You know, I'm here to hear from all of you.
Right.
But if 3,000 people call leadership and say, we want the IDEA Full Funding Act passed. What we need is your help to have parents fully understand, and as the parent of a son with special needs, I often say to folks, look, this isn't just about kids with special needs. This is about making sure that our class sizes in our public schools remain manageable so that the teachers in this room can do their full and complete job, so that each student has the ability and the opportunity to learn and be successful. I truly believe that IDEA full funding is the key to making sure that we have to stop all these cuts in our schools. And what we're talking about is $30 billion. That's what we're talking about here. You know, it's what are our priorities in this nation? Where are our priorities in this nation? I know that most parents believe it's their children and their children's education and making sure that we have a planet to have them inherit. You know, those are some of the priorities. And so I just commend you and the school board here for all that you've done. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul. Thank you for your service. I appreciate running for Congress. That's awesome. Quick comment, and then another sort of longer comment. The brought up corruption before in D.C. The President Trump never divested from his business. He continues to own 100% and profit from 100% of his business, and that's the glaring difference between him and other past presidents. He has hundreds of billions of dollars in assets and business operations all over the world. He just pitched his Doral Hotel as the next location for the G7 summit. This is highly inappropriate, and he should divest, and the Congress should even consider passing the bill stating him to divest. That's the first comment. Second comment is kind of in response to a couple of the comments already brought up today about impeachment. So I think we have to take a step back here and think about what's going to happen in the next, 13 months. I'm deeply concerned about foreign and domestic threats to the integrity and fairness of the 2020, including what happens to the candidates, their campaigns, malign foreign influence measures, disinformation, hacking, etc. I speak here closely. You guys are understandably concerned about the politics of impeachment in moderate districts. I'll get to it. Yeah, I'll get to it. You went to Congress to make people's lives better. I totally get that. When we are here, I totally get that. But the next election is in jeopardy because of the actions of what Trump has done. He has welcomed Russian interference in the Oval Office. He said, "Yeah, I'll take dirt from an opponent." The news yesterday and the last few days about him inviting, trying to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden's son is extremely alarming and dangerous. The actions of his administration, investigating FBI people, calling them spies and all that, has caused a culture of retribution and intimidation within the FBI. Whereby, they're going to be afraid of following up on leads and protecting our nation, our democracy, because of that. Okay, so here's my
I think I get the gist.
Yeah, so we've seen the next election, Democrats are relying on the next election to be able to be a fair and square opportunity to remove Trump. But because of Trump's actions, it's hard for us to rely with confidence on that election being a fair and the integrity of it and the safety of it being, in control. So Democrats are in the Congress right now. To be perfectly frank, they're being trampled by the administration, and either we change the strategy about how we're approaching, whether it's using inherent contempt or using the power of the purse, the change the administration is doing, or I do believe we have to do impeachment because the next election is in jeopardy. If we don't punish Trump for welcoming dirt from a foreign country, from another nation, and if we don't punish him now trying to pressure the Ukrainian president, I'm afraid that we won't have any control over the Wild West in the next several months. I'm sorry for it's a lot hard, a lot of nuance to explain, and I want to act like we're just crazy left wingers or anything, but it's really alarming.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here and for sharing your views on this. I want to start with really the first concept that you started with, which is no president and frankly no member of Congress should be allowed to continue working and operating inside his or her business and receive the benefits of that when they become a member of Congress. And so that's why, and I'll be honest, it's not even popular sometimes on our side of the aisle that I say, I think you ought to have to sell all your individual stocks.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There are people there on our side of the aisle who still serve on corporate boards while serving as members of Congress.
No, it shouldn't.
And so I've called for look, I spent over 20 years working in a private sector business, a Fortune 500 company. You guys all know that. I can tell you there is never one board meeting that I attended that I should have been in if I were a member of Congress. Because there's just too much. And having had that experience, it's really hard for my colleagues to argue with me, because this is not hypothetical to me. If the board's in there talking about Medicare policy and reimbursement, and I've got authority over the FDA, that is nowhere for a member of Congress to be. We shouldn't be able to lobby. If you're not running for public office in this nation to serve your neighbors and do what you and your community thinks are the right things to do, then you shouldn't run for public office in this nation.
Yep.
So let me be very, very clear about that. You mentioned these, but look, the allegations that have come out in the last 24 hours related to Ukraine are very serious allegations. It's pretty true. And I will tell you that this, I think, started to unfold on Thursday. The Inspector General, I believe, has sat down with Adam Schiff on House Intelligence, but members of Congress have not yet been briefed. We have only seen what you have seen in the press reports. So I want to acknowledge that it is a very serious allegation that's been made, and I look forward to Adam and House Intelligence working to get to the bottom of it. So thank you for being here.
May I make a quick follow-up?
I'm sorry.
So,
We're going to take
We have people waiting to ask questions.
We're going to take
Thank you
one
so
final
much.
question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Erin, and I live in Prior Lake. I have 3 kids, and I also am a teacher of 10 years, not currently teaching, but I'm staying home with my kids. My question is, what will you be doing to help close the achievement gap in Minnesota between white students and students of color? And also, what will you be doing to help get more teachers of color hired, because that also helps students of color have higher graduation rates.
Well, thank you so much. It's just an incredibly important topic. I mean, I don't have the stats on the top of my head, but the stats of if a young person of color has a teacher of color by 3rd grade, what that means in terms of their eventual academic achievement. The stats are indisputable. And so, look, I think we need to work very hard to have teaching be a public service opportunity in this country, where we are actively recruiting in our colleges, in our universities, people of color. You know, one of the things about serving in this Congress especially is that it is one of the most diverse Congresses in the history of the nation. And so when people see people who look like them, it makes a difference in their own lives. So, look, we've got a gap in educational attainment. We've got a gap in the unemployment rate for African American and Hispanic Americans. We've got gaps and racial disparities in almost every sector. Black maternal mortality rates are incredibly high. And I think we have to respond with this as a nation, that racial disparities have to be addressed. They have to be acknowledged, and we need good public policy to move forward. But you have my absolute commitment to work on these issues.
In light of the time consumed with the previous question, could we ask one more question, please?
Am I the boss?
You're the moderator. Yes.
That was a really Minnesota.
Wow. Sure, go for it.
Sure, we're going to take one more question.
Thank you.
How about that?
Thank you very much, Representative Craig. I'm Therese Needham. I live in Savage as well. I'm going to return to healthcare. It's kind of a starting and ending point for us all. And I am lucky enough to have employer-based healthcare. I have a family of 5. None of us has astronomical, catastrophic health issues. However, it's a high deductible plan. We have fairly low premiums, but because of the wild variety and variation in cost, over the course of a year, and I manage this very carefully, I max out that HSA and I call and spread out payment plans and whatnot. I pay more in healthcare costs to providers on a monthly basis, like 150% of my mortgage goes to healthcare. And we're not unhealthy. So I would like to know, from your perspective, going forward, if perchance, following the 2020 elections, we were to have an atmosphere that was that put a far more progressive healthcare policy out there on the table, where would you be in supporting that?
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And my team is going to look at me going 2 minutes, because healthcare I could talk for 2 minutes on. Look, I think there were some improvements under the ACA that obviously allowed more individuals to get health insurance coverage. But we actually haven't addressed the problem in this country. And even some of the quote-unquote progressive plans that are out there don't address the true problem in my mind. And that is that our healthcare system is a fee-for-service pay system. It rewards hospitals and physicians and drug companies and device manufacturers for volume. Why? Even Medicare is a fee-for-service pay system in this nation. And I think the problem with today's healthcare is we aren't focused on prevention. We're focused on disease. And we've got to reimagine how we could pay for healthcare. But I think it's even beyond the current discussions and debate on healthcare. What about an outcomes-based, value-based care system? Right? So I think there's some substantial reforms that we have got to make to healthcare. The other thing, and this is as a person who actually had to manage a self-insured healthcare plan for a company. We had 16,000 covered lives in the U.S. alone. There are 2 things I would say. One of the unintended consequences of the Affordable Care Act, and I've been a proponent of keeping what's working and a proponent of fixing what's not. One of the unintended consequences is something called the Cadillac tax. And it sounds eerie, right? That if someone's, got a Cadillac healthcare plan, it was sort of billed as the healthcare plan that executives had. That you would have to pay a tax. Well, let me tell you who has a Cadillac tax type plan. Labor organizations, because they've gone in and given up pay to have better health care benefits in this country. And one of the unintended consequences, reclaiming my time. And I will finish up. One of the unintended consequences is that as the ACA implemented the Cadillac tax, more and more private plans started cost shifting to employees on the premiums, and they started raising the deductibles. It was an unintended consequence because those companies did not want to pay the Cadillac tax.
Right.
The U.S. House, and it's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk right now, has passed a repeal of the Cadillac tax. So it doesn't get a lot of talk, but again, this is my geeking out on healthcare. It's a problem. And then the final thing is exactly what I started with. The thing that I could not control in my own health plan was the cost of drugs, especially biologics. 2% of the biologics in my health plan represented 40% of the cost in my health plan, and that is consistent with plans across the nation. So we're going to have to take on big pharma, and it's going to be hard, and we're going to need all of you to stand with us because they're going to put a whole lot of pressure on us not to do the right thing. But thank you for ending with health care. It is the #1 topic in this congressional district. I am incredibly passionate about doing this in the right policy way. And I'll support a good idea because it's a good idea. I don't care where it comes from. So thank you so much.
Being here today. This was exciting and fun for me, and thank you for being here. This is so great that we can come and hear your thoughts, and you're honest and so smart. You know everything.
Well, thank you all. This is what representative democracy looks like. Thank you for being here today.
Yes.
Bye-bye.